Thank you very much, Madame Lucini. Indeed, you provided a very good introduction into the kind of presentations that I have been asked to do, and even the kind of presentations that I was not necessarily prepared to do, but I can also actually speak on the handbook which Kathleen
That's perfect.
was about to present, because it is a handbook that we have actually developed in very close cooperation. So I'm very much familiar with the handbook that she would have wanted to present to you, outlining basically the main steps on how to engage with diaspora. But I think, if you allow me, I would actually start with my presentation, simply because of the flow, because the other handbook or training material that we have developed, that I would like to present to the audience now during this session, is more general about the links between migration and development. And maybe I could start with this presentation first. So, working with governments in countries of origin and countries of destination, because I have also had the opportunity to listen a little bit into the previous session, where you had representatives from countries in sub-Saharan Africa and from Tunisia, so where you had already touched upon the necessity and the logic that the topic of diaspora engagement indeed is a topic where you ideally work together with the countries of origin and countries of the destination. So basically, coming from that session, we as IOM work with both the countries of origin and countries of destination on this topic of diaspora engagement. And normally the way how we introduce this topic is that we speak to the government officials, but also to the diaspora associations, to the civil society, about the linkages between migration and development. And for that reason, we have developed a whole set of training modules which cover essentially, let me just show you, which cover essentially the 5 areas that you see listed here on this slide. So the first module is really about to empower the policymakers, but also those that practically work in diaspora engagement, on diaspora engagement, in developing the policies.
Very sorry to interrupt you, Tanja.
Yes. Yes.
So have you shared your screen with us?
Yes.
Okay.
No, wait a minute. No, you're right. Let me just, all right.
Very good.
So what I started to explain is essentially those modules that we incorporated in this training materials. And we use them, like I said, both with when we do capacity building with government stakeholders, but also with civil society, with the diaspora organizations themselves. And we use them both in countries of origin and in countries of destination, because the main messages equally apply to both sides. On both sides, we basically see the need to empower the policymakers and the practitioners to develop the policy as such. Diaspora engagement policy, like normally governments first of all develop a policy which is the framework where they can then further develop a diaspora engagement strategy. And I will also talk a bit about that first point a little bit later in my presentation, because on that specific point, we have developed yet another guide, which really takes the people involved step by step through the whole process on how to formulate such cohesive, consistent, policy coherent diaspora engagement strategy. So the first point is to give people that are supposed to develop policies a better idea on how they can start this whole process. Then these modules also want to provide those who then will work out these policies and work on strategies with the theoretical foundation, and to provide more guidance and information on the international frameworks, the regional frameworks, how to take into account the national frameworks. And then with these modules, we also want to, we are diving a little bit more into this whole discourse on diaspora, something that you had a very good opportunity today. You had a very interesting discourse, and these kind of exercises are really crucial to increase a better understanding of why we are talking about diaspora and how we could be talking about diaspora. Then these modules are also talking about the migration and development processes more globally. So we are trying to put the work that we do with the governments on diaspora always into this global perspective. And as you can well imagine, with the Global Compact on Migration and also with the Sustainable Development Goals, those are, of course, the main reference documents since 2018, the one, since 2015, the other, that we use as a framework for the work on migration and development, explaining why orderly, safe, and regular migration is a key accelerator for any governments, be it country of origin or country of destination, to try to achieve not only the Sustainable Development Goals, but also in pursuing the objectives of the Global Compact on Migration. And finally, we want with these modules to also support the policymakers and the practitioners to better understand what are the complexities when we talk about human development, human mobility and development. Because it is one thing to say that safe and orderly and regular migration is a key accelerator to achieve the SDGs, but then this whole process of migration, throughout the whole migration continuum, there are so many aspects and so many phases where it is crucial to ensure that this migration is indeed safe, and that we avoid the risks and the pitfalls that are imminent to this process, to ensure that migration can indeed contribute to development. And of course, development has also a lot of impact on the migration process. So those are a little bit the topics that we also want to address with these training modules, to create that better understanding and that awareness. What are these linkages? What do we have to be aware of to ensure that migration can indeed harness, how we can harness the benefits of migration for development. Let me move to the next slide. So in these training modules, we use a learning approach, and we basically this learning approach, you can then see in this training materials that we have a lot of group works, a lot of discussions where we encourage cooperative learning among the participants, and the participants are usually representatives and members from different ministries, because when we start to work with governments on migration and development, we ensure that we always bring together all the relevant line ministries that are concerned and that should be concerned in this discussion about migration and development. So it is usually an interministerial and an interagency group that we are talking to and that we are training on these materials, anything from ministries of interior to ministries of foreign affairs with their embassies and consular staff, to ministries of labor, ministries of education, because there was also the mentioning of what's the link between labor migration and development, and labor migration and diaspora, circular migration. Then you have the central bank, you have foreign investment, trade and export. So it is usually a multi-stakeholder approach as well, where we apply this cooperative learning. There is a lot of experiential learning, and we have a lot of case studies built into these training program, into these modules, where the participants have a possibility to solve problems and come up with solutions in teamwork, in the discussions that are taking place during the training. The whole modules are centered basically around first, let's say, the nexus between migration and development, where we provide a bit more of the theory and the theoretical concepts on migration, development, contextualizing migration and development policy. Then we have a part where we discuss the frameworks for cooperation, because you have international frameworks, global frameworks, you have regional frameworks on migration and development, and what are the basic steps, let's say, in migration and development policy making and planning. And then we also look at the current practice in the field of migration and development. So how can you actually strengthen the collaboration between policymakers and diasporas for development, with some, again, concrete case studies, with some group work where we some role plays also, where we encourage, the participants to take on different roles and to think of how they could come up with a collaboration, with a solution for a very practical problem that is to be solved by diaspora, where the government wants to reach out to diaspora, and how to include diaspora in working out such solutions. But talking about migration and development, we also need to talk about the cultural dimensions of migration and development. We are also talking about how to facilitate labor mobility and circular migration in this context. And finally, these modules are also, there's also a chapter or a module that talks about how governments, how policymakers can start or to mobilize financial resources generated through migration. So there's this whole chapter, not only on remittances, that's why it's called financial resources, but also talking about philanthropy, talking about savings, and more recently, we also included a chapter on how governments can facilitate migration and trade. So how can diaspora also facilitate trade linkages? Yeah, and basically this is a little bit what I said before, that we have a lot of group activities, discussions. We have that each session basically also contains case studies and examples. Normally, it is a face-to-face training workshop, and these materials actually have not yet been translated into online courses like everything else now during COVID-19. So these training modules are still made for face-to-face trainings. but I think with the experience that we have all gathered during the last year, if it's not possible in the foreseeable future to actually organize in-person trainings again, these modules could easily also be translated into online materials. Now, I said in the beginning that when we work with governments and policymakers, but also with practitioners on policy development, we have developed in that context a more specific guide how we can work in a series of workshops with government stakeholders and practitioners on how to actually develop a diaspora engagement strategy. So we thought when we started to work on this about a tool which would basically describe for people who are yet to start working on something like this, what could be the format of such a strategy and what would be the main elements that such a strategy should contain in order to be comprehensive, to be effective, and to promote the approach was that we basically worked with best practice. So we have developed this tool when I was still working with the regional office of IOM in Vienna, and we joined forces together with Diaspora Matters, which is an organization with 30-year plus experience on diaspora engagement. They are based in Ireland, which you might know is one of the countries which has a lot of very good, if not best practice when it comes to diaspora engagement, simply because Ireland has a huge and a very old, a very mature diaspora. And in Ireland, basically all levels of government, from the villages to all the way to the central, engaged in diaspora engagement. And so build that Ireland, because this is where the organization Diaspora Matters is based. But this organization, again, in its 30-year plus experience working with on diaspora engagement, they have worked basically all around the globe. So the tool points out the best practice from the different countries in different regions of the world that can speak to the various chapters that should be part of such a diaspora engagement strategy. And it is, as I said, to be used in a series of workshops, where basically in every workshop you can then use this guide to develop that strategy bit by bit until at the end you have the complete diaspora engagement strategy. So the strategy document as such, together with an action plan, because a good strategy you also want to operationalize. So you need to have a plan of action. How do you go about putting this strategy into action? Who is responsible? Who are the partner agencies that you need to work together with in order to implement parts of that strategy and to achieve certain results? And that action plan needs to also come with a monitoring and evaluation framework. So a strategy is also only as good as the monitoring and evaluation around that strategy, because you also want to be able to track whether you have made any progress in implementing that strategy. So the tool, as I said, it basically guides this whole process of developing the strategy, plus an action plan, plus a monitoring and evaluation framework. And with that, we then basically, yeah, okay. So here you can see on this slide what the format of such a strategy based on our analysis of a lot of different diaspora engagement policies and good practice or best practice should look like. So besides the introduction, where you present the context in which that strategy has been developed, you might also provide some definitions, because I can tell you that pretty much every country has a different definition of what they understand as diaspora, where you also explain a little bit about the methodology, how you went about developing that strategy, who did you consult with in developing that strategy, where you make the linkages of that strategy, how that fits into those global frameworks, whether it's the objectives of the Global Compact on Migration or the SDGs. Following that introduction, you do a situational analysis. And that situational analysis would provide some insights into the historical diaspora, let's say, and the current trends, it provides, in the best case scenario, also information that stems from a diaspora mapping. And on the diaspora mapping, I will come back when I talk about the presentation of Kathleen, where she introduces the Diaspora Handbook. So the situational analysis is really key in the sense that because of the situational analysis, you should then be able to identify what are the objectives of your strategy, right? So once you know where is your diaspora, who is your diaspora, what's the profile of that diaspora, you can then start to think about what is it that you really want to do with the diaspora. And, given the consultations that you have with diaspora, ideally, of course, when you develop a diaspora engagement strategy, you can then, together with diaspora, identify and define these objectives of your strategy. And the various strands that you want to address, or let's say the different work areas, yeah, if you like that word better. So what are the different areas in which you want to engage with diaspora and how you want to do that? And then, like I said, the strategy comes with an action plan, and of course also with a costing, with a budget, because if you just have a strategy which lists everything that you want to do with diaspora, but you don't go into the detail of specifying what that will cost, then the likelihood that you will actually implement that strategy is fairly little. Yeah. So yes, the action plan defines who is then in the lead on which kind of activity. You define a timeline. How much time do you give yourself? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years to reach a certain objective? And what is it? What's the cost for that? So that the government can also budget for the implementation of that strategy. Or you can use the strategy for fundraising. If it's not the government itself that can fund all of it, then you have also something that you can reach out to donors and fundraise among donors to be able to implement parts of this strategy. Let's not forget that, like I said in the beginning, diaspora engagement is also not something that's only to be funded by the country, by the home country of the diaspora. Yeah? We see many examples where the countries of destination are also engaging in facilitating the diaspora engagement of specific diaspora communities that are on their territory, to enable them to engage in the country of origin. Yeah? So it can be very much a joint investment and undertaking. And last, but definitely not least, that strategy will have a section, and hopefully a strong section, which talks about monitoring and evaluation, which describes the methodology that has been chosen to go about monitoring and evaluation, and how you are going to assess and measure the progress that you have been able to make in implementing that strategy. With that, I'm already at the end of my presentation. And if you allow me, I would then basically go, let me just switch the presentations now. Okay. Just give me a second, please. I need to go back here. So stop share, and then where is now my, okay, and now I share this presentation. Okay, can you already see something?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, okay. Then let me also go on full screen here. Now I need to reduce again. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So now you should see the full screen. Can you see the full screen? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good. So the roadmap that Kathleen wanted to present to you is a publication that IOM has produced together with the Migration Policy Institute a couple of years back. And this roadmap essentially lies out the steps that, again, based on analysis of best practice of a number of governments in different parts of the world, that have been identified as the most logical way on how to, and the most important steps that you should follow when you intend to engage with your diaspora community. So the first step, and here you can see again, is to identify the goals of your diaspora engagement. And you also have to, if you want to decide what it is that you want to work with diaspora, whether it is about working with diaspora and benefit from their skills, or whether you want to work with diaspora and benefit from their financial resources, or whether you want to work with diaspora doing just about everything, or what I have also seen, you basically work with diaspora primarily to maintain, let's say, if there are some governments that I've worked with that are not necessarily interested to work with diaspora on the development in the country of origin, but they rather work with diaspora because they see them as a carrier of cultural identity. So it's rather the other way around. In such instances, the diaspora strategy is not so much focused about what diaspora can do to help with the development in the country of origin, but it's rather how the government can support the diaspora communities abroad in order to maintain the language, to maintain the culture, to maintain tradition. And very often it is also about protecting the rights of diaspora in the countries of destination. So in the first step, the idea is, or that you need to define what is it that you really want to do with diaspora or for diaspora, and you need to assess the capacities that you have on the one side in the country of origin to provide this to work with diaspora or to provide the services that you want to provide to diaspora. So you have to identify and you come up with an inventory, let's say, of who are the institutions and the programs that are maybe already in place at the national level, but also going down to the regional level and especially at the local level. Yeah, the local level is really key in many ways and in many instances in connecting with diaspora. So when you want to do this assessment, you need to look at all the levels of what's existing in terms of institutions and programs to engage with diaspora. And on the other side, you also need to assess what are the capacities in the diaspora to engage with the country of origin in terms of human resources, but also financial resources. And like that, you would, in the first step, number one, try to identify what it is that you really want to work on with the diaspora community. Investment, knowledge transfer. Is it about money, about remittances, or is it maybe about the cultural capital? Yeah. So that is step number one. Next, you need to know your diaspora. And what do you do to have that knowledge, better knowledge about your diaspora? And this is where this diaspora mapping comes in. And as IOM, we have done over the years, or let me rather say over the decades, we have done a lot of diaspora mapping, so that finally last year, or already a year and a half ago, we decided that we should, with the help of the University of Maastricht, we should actually come up with a global methodology on diaspora mapping. And so based on some 150 diaspora mappings that IOM has conducted over the years all over the world, we have now a methodology, I would say a rather solid and sound methodology, how to do diaspora mapping in different contexts, depending on what is the budget that you have available to engage in such an exercise. And again, learning from experience, which kind of surveys, which kind of diaspora mapping do you best do in which context? Depending on how your diaspora is structured, how fragmented or how dispersed your diaspora is, how do you actually reach out to your diaspora in the most effective way to get the information that you need for your diaspora engagement strategy? So diaspora mapping is one key source of information to know more about your diaspora, but you can of course also analyze census data of countries of destination. You can do a skills inventory, you can organize listening exercises, and or you can try to identify, let's say, the key community leaders, the key interlocutors with diaspora, and we all know the term, the focus group interviews with such key community leaders. Yeah, those are all different ways and methodologies how to get to know more about your diaspora. And it is the very important second step as you engage with diaspora. And then the third step, and it is the third of 5 steps, but I would say from my experience, it is actually the most important, the most crucial step. Because even with the diaspora mapping, you already face very often situations where you don't get the type of response that you would really hope for. And why is that? Because diaspora needs to trust, needs to understand, why is it that my government, is reaching out to me? Why do they need to know like everything that they want to know about me? What do they do with that information? I have in my previous region, which was covering the countries in Southeast Europe, in Eastern Europe, and in Central Asia, we have conducted also a number of such diaspora mappings. And, it is, I remember one particular case where, we also struggled a bit to, it's about a country which has, in the size of its population, a very large diaspora. And the diaspora is pretty much dispersed all over the world. And when we tried to do the diaspora mapping, we could, of course, not trace down the diaspora in every single country of this world. So we focused only on the 10 main countries of destination for this particular diaspora. And despite the fact that we had a team of local researchers that were speaking the language, really hard to get huge numbers, let's say, of respondents to reply to this, essentially because what we heard back from the diaspora was like, how come that 20 years after I left this country, this is the first time that the government is reaching out to me?
Very sorry to interrupt, Tanja,
yes?
if I may. So we still have 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
and we have inside the 20 minutes at least 15 minutes for the debate. So
yes.
So just about concluding and.
Thank you for. And with so much experience, I always get carried away when building trust is a step, and I think you can also read here on the screen the different ways how you can try to build this very essential trust. Now, the next step is then, once, let's say, you have built that trust relationship, then you can start with mobilizing the diaspora. But not only the diaspora. It's always a multi-stakeholder approach where you also need to engage with the government and with the even private sector, with the civil society. And again, on the screen here, you can see some ideas on how you can mobilize the diaspora. And of course, the boundaries between building trust and mobilizing and even the diaspora mapping, those are not steps that you can do in a strictly consecutive manner. Those are all interventions that are in a way interlinking with each other, and the boundaries are fluent. And the last step is then the actual engagement of diaspora in development. And that means that you do not only engage with diaspora when you want to do the diaspora mapping, or when you want to formulate the policy or the diaspora engagement strategy, where diaspora, of course, should also be on the table, but you also include diaspora in the evaluation and in the monitoring of that strategy. Another reason why it's really important that such a strategy comes with a monitoring and evaluation framework, because the reason why you do monitoring and the reason why you engage diaspora also in the monitoring and evaluation is that you also want to be able to do course corrections. So when you see that maybe even if you have defined the objectives of the strategy in broad consultations, but over the course of 2 or 3 years, you find that one of the objectives is maybe really not getting the necessary support and feedback, neither from the diaspora, nor is it a priority of the government any longer, then you should also be able to do a course correction. And so with this slide, what we basically want to show is that the engagement of diaspora is not just happening in one step or in one phase of diaspora engagement, but it's basically the diaspora needs to be consulted and needs to be engaged from the beginning to the end. And I think, with that, Kathleen basically also concluded her presentation by just highlighting really those 5 key steps that have been identified in this roadmap for engaging diasporas in development. So thanks again for still being able to listen and still being able to take in more information on how to engage with diaspora. I hope that maybe with those presentations, I was able to give a bit of an idea of how that can practically be done. And I'm open for your comments or for your questions. Thank you.